Who were the classical Attic authors? Here it is: 4 playwrights, 3 philosopher historians, and 10 orators. And probably the most famous of all of them was Plato. Plato's writings may be the most famous of any philosopher in history, whose dialogues, the Platonic dialogues, are centered around the philosophy of Socrates. One of the most influential of Plato's ideas were the Platonic ideals, as we call them, or Platonic ideas or forms. The idea that you could have a circle in the real world, but it's never really perfect. But mathematically, we know there's a such thing as a perfect idealized circle. It has certain dimensions that can be measured with numbers like pi and so forth. And therefore, for virtue, for a perfect soldier, a perfect rock, there is an ideal perfect form that exists somewhere beyond the physical realm. And that really sent philosophy and what we call the literature of Western civilization onto this really interesting path. And it's very much due to Plato. And if you want to study Plato in a full immersion 10-day experience, then you should sign up for Ancient Language Institute's Plato Camp, a full immersion camp, 10 days from June 22nd to July 1st at the Winston-Salem campus of Wake Forest University. And you'll be taught, of course, by some of the best teachers around in this full immersion 10-day experience. The ideal participant for Plato Camp has an early intermediate to advanced reading level. This can truly be a life-changing experience. Learn more at the link in the description. And if you just want to learn Greek from the beginning right now, well, we're teaching online beginner ancient Greek as well as Latin, Biblical Hebrew, and Old English. The deadline to sign up for the summer term is April 12th. Go check us out at ancientlanguage.com. And now, who are all of the other authors besides Plato? Everybody knows Plato. Some of these others, you might know their names. There are 4 playwrights, and 3 of them are tragedians. That is, they wrote tragedies. First is Aeschylus, followed by Sophocles, and then Euripides. Then the only classical Attic comedian whose works have been preserved. Again, I'm talking about works that have been preserved. These are the authors that form like the canon of the classical Attic literature, right? So there's other authors that certainly existed, and there's some fragments, but the really big ones are the ones I'm talking about today. So Aristophanes is the comic playwright from the classical Attic period. And then we have 3 who are philosophers or historians, and that's Plato, Xenophon, and Thucydides. Thucydides wrote one big, huge, famous work about the Peloponnesian War, and Xenophon actually finished it. Xenophon, like Plato, he was a student of Socrates, but Xenophon also did a whole bunch of other crazy things, not just philosophy, and he wrote about it in histories like the Anabasis. And then there are the 10 Attic orators, the canon of 10. These are the ones whose works have been preserved and were commented on in antiquity. And I remember them with this little mnemonic. And using this mnemonic, I put them in the order that they were born in. And it's in ancient Greek. Anti tu lyusai tu sandras, isologi isaitata, lykos hyperpuson, aisku nomenu demu denu. What does all that mean? So the key words there are the beginnings of the names of each of the authors: Antiphon, Lysias, Andocides, Isocrates, Isaias, Lycurgus, Hyperides, Aeschines, Demosthenes, Dinarchus. Now, why should you even care about these authors in particular? Why are they called classical? Were they the only ones writing in this time period? Okay, so Attic. What is Attic? Attic is the dialect of the Athenians. The Athenians, of course, controlled their city of Athens in the 5th century BC and the 4th century BC, before and after as well. But those 2 centuries are the classical ancient Greek period. And there were other authors who wrote at the same time as some of these, but they didn't write in Attic. They wrote in Ionic, like, say, Herodotus. This period was filled with dynamism, upheaval, economic exchange. It was the ascendancy of Athens as one of the most dominant forces, if not, in fact, the most dominant force at certain points in the Greek-speaking world. Allied with Sparta, it famously defeated the Persian invasion at the beginning of the 5th century. That's when we think of as the beginning of the classical period. Maybe not the whole 5th century, but right about at the Battle of Marathon, when the Greeks really did defeat the Persians at the end of that war, although they kind of come back the whole time. We'll talk about that another time. And then the very infamous Peloponnesian War, where the Spartans and the Athenians battle for hegemony of Greece and the greater Greek-speaking world. And all of that famously ends as Philip II rises from Macedon and his son Alexander the Great, ends all of that completely by the beginning of what we call Hellenism, the Hellenistic period. When Alexander the Great dies in 323, we call that the end of the classical period, arbitrarily, of course, and the beginning of the Hellenistic Koine period. That's Gini for you modern Greek speakers. What usually makes a body of literature classical is that later scholars or authors end up admiring, revering, or imitating that literature. And Attic ended up getting that status, the classical Attic literature. These, I think 17, did I count right, authors that I just rattled off a few minutes ago. Because of the incredible explosion of ideas that were coming out of Athens in the 5th and the 4th centuries BC, ideas that were imitated and expounded upon for generations, the prestige of these authors only increased through the centuries, indeed the millennia to the present day. Hence the Koine dialect, which is fundamentally Attic mixed with some Ionic, has a body of literature that is very strongly influenced by the classical Attic authors. Now, to learn a little bit more about the historical context of these authors, I've been working on something for the past few months, which I'm ready to show you now, and that is a spreadsheet. Yes, Luke Ranieri makes yet another spreadsheet. Well, this spreadsheet is going eventually to be as many ancient Greek authors as I'm able to put in here, but I really wanted to focus on putting the classical Attic authors all on one spreadsheet, but not just their names, their works. So why is that important? Because these people, they all knew each other. They lived in the same relatively small city by modern standards, and they wrote about each other. They made fun of each other in some of these works, and it's very difficult to understand how all of these fit together without really seeing them, I think, in this kind of two-dimensional way, two-dimensional being better than one-dimensional, to see how these works line up historically. So you can look at this anytime. It's bit.ly/Ranieri Greek literature. And here I have all of those main authors. There are fragments of a few other authors from the same time period who were writing in Attic and were Athenian, but these are the main really important ones. So, like I said, we have the Playwrights, then we have the prose authors, including the Alexandrian canon of 10 orators. That's right, these 10 orators whose names I mentioned in order a little while ago. Zooming out, we can see these colors. So what do these colors mean? The colors, again, they go with the name at the top, right? And the color starts in the year that they were born. Some of these years are approximate, so I did my best. Where the color begins is the year that they were born, and where that color ends is when they were recorded as having passed away. So the three tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and the comedian Aristophanes. On the left is the year, and there, of course, are some works by some of these authors that are published in the same year. Of course, the trilogy, the Oresteia, is a great example of that. 3 plays that were all published or performed in the same year. And then we have Sophocles, and then it's so interesting to see how Sophocles and Euripides had works that were performed at the same time. Also, we have Electra by both of them, written and published probably in about the same year. So you can understand how there's some competition potentially between these two famous authors. Then as for Aristophanes, he is writing at the same time, and Aristophanes often talks about Euripides or pokes fun at him or references his works. Since these authors reference one another, my hope one day is actually to read everything in the original in chronological order. So I would read, for example, Medea, and then Heracleide, and then Oedipus Rex, then go back over to Hippolytus, Andromache, but then read the Acarnanians by Aristophanes, that sort of thing. And you can do that too now, or at least you can have a little bit more historical context in this visual way. I find this to be very helpful. Also, at a glance, isn't it interesting that we have Helen, Lysistrata, Phoenician women, the women at the Thesmophoria, all plays where women play a prominent role around the same time. That's interesting. Does that mean anything? I don't know. But it is something that stands out in this scheme here. Now, Socrates was famous throughout the whole city. Everybody knew him, certainly when The Clouds was written. The Clouds is Aristophanes making fun of the sophists, especially, but literally Socrates as well. He thought Socrates was an airhead, hence the clouds and so forth. They're up in the clouds. And so Socrates is a character, an important character in The Clouds. It might be sort of a character assassination of him. In fact, in Plato's Apology of Socrates, he refers to that character assassination by Aristophanes in The Clouds, and how that didn't do him any good. And guess who is one of the characters in the symposium? Aristophanes. It's so interesting how these authors have one another actually existing in them. So to really learn and understand the history of this time period, we can absolutely read about it. Excellent historians have summarized it and put it in order. But to really understand it in depth, we have to read the originals or in translation, but it's also critical to understand the context when each one of these things was happening, because none of them were working in isolation. They were all riffing off of each other. Xenophon was another student of Socrates like Plato. He wrote a symposium, though not about the same symposium. Also, the Anabasis. In the Anabasis, Xenophon talks about their daring escape out of Persia. Worth reading, amazing stuff. But Xenophon also wrote an apology of Socrates, but unlike Plato, who was present for Socrates actually delivering his speech, and wrote a dialogue, sort of a monologue, which we can imagine was pretty close to the original, though platonicized, who knows how much. Xenophon got his stuff secondhand, so this is interesting. This is important to know. It doesn't mean that one account is better than the other. This one's certainly more famous, the one by Plato, but that helps us remember the historical context. For Plato, I ended up putting them all in the order that they took place. Well, that means we have an overlap of lifespans here. I put Socrates starting in this darker green-blue color, and then when Plato is born, it becomes this solid green color. When Socrates dies, it becomes light green, and the end of the light green is when Plato dies. Now, Plato was writing most or all of this stuff in the 300s for sure, but when each one of these took place in the historical context, especially the symposium, when you learn about the symposium and how it connects to Thucydides and Alcibiades, and oh my gosh, we're going to talk about Alcibiades. We got some orators over here. We're getting there. Thucydides, he was a general for the Athenians. He ended up not doing as great as he should have, and the war got exiled for it, but ended up writing some of the first prose in Attic. And he wrote about the history of the Peloponnesian War. And the events that he wrote about quite extensively go from 431 to 411. So this is where it starts and ends. So this lighter blue is his lifespan. But this is when the Peloponnesian War took place, but it didn't end actually in 411. It continued. Xenophon decided, well, he was just going to continue it. And he continued recounting the events, and that ends all the way down here. That's what this lighter pink color is doing. And in the middle, of course, is the polity of the Lacedaemonians, the constitution of the Spartans, and that's from the time period of 387 to 375. So hence the different colors. Hopefully the color scheme is easy enough to follow. And then the orators. And I'll tell you what, I did not expect myself to fall in love with Attic oratory, but I kind of think it's the best thing about classical Attic literature now. And maybe all of ancient Greek literature. Could be exaggerating, but I do feel that way right now. And I'll make another video in the future about why Attic oratory is so cool. But for now, here we have a scheme of the orators and their lifespans. Here's a glance of all 10 when they lived: Antiphon, Lysias, Andocides, Isocrates, Isaias, Lycurgus, Hyperides, Aeschines, Demosthenes, and Dinarchus. And that's when their works are. Every single work that is complete, I think I have all of them on here, except the second half of Demosthenes. Demosthenes, he just wouldn't shut up. He just had a lot to say, a lot of orations, so only about half are there so far, but hopefully I'll finish all of it. But except for that, I think every single major work that has been preserved is on this spreadsheet. And it's so interesting to see how these events correlate together. Plato talks about certain events, Xenophon talks about other events that are related to those, and so do the orators. What happens to Alcibiades, everything, oh boy, that's enough. I'll just drop that name, Alcibiades. Look that up, and you'll be like, whoa, all kinds of weird things happen with that guy. The orators are often overlooked because a lot of them are logographers, that is, they're writing logoi, which are speeches, to be said by others who are defending themselves. A famous example is Lysias, who was a metic or metic, and numbers of these orations are traditional, and they're ordered that way for all kinds of different reasons. I have tried to put them into chronological order as best I can. Some of the dates aren't known, like on the murder of Eratosthenes, but that first one, a great example of a logos, a speech that Lysias wrote for someone else to defend himself against the charge of murder. So some of those legal orations are very interesting, but I especially love the defense of democracy that we read in Isocrates, like in the Panegyricus, as well as, especially, and most famously perhaps, Demosthenes. I'm going to have to do a whole video about the Attic orators, and if you want to know too why the Attic orators are so amazing, please leave a comment down below. I'll just tell you that Attic oratory, which essentially was the innovation of prose. It actually precedes Thucydides. Antiphon precedes Thucydides. Thucydides was a student of Antiphon in rhetoric. This was the combination of the spoken word with actually preparing remarks in a way that would be really effective, not just for all the rhetorical figures and all that, which is great, but for the sound of it. They figured out, well, we have these long and short syllables that in poetry give us the meter, like in the beginning of the Iliad, me ninae detea peleia deo Achilleus, right? Those long and short syllables, that's the rhythm of epic. But we're going to use completely different rhythms, but very carefully in order to have the maximum impact of our speech. And these speeches by these orators, they demonstrate so effectively what I've always talked about, that these long and short syllables are so fundamental to the prose literature, because it wasn't just the orators, it was the ones who followed the orators, including Xenophon and Plato and Thucydides, who also took those long and short syllables into account to give their writings maximum impact, maximum effect. So, if you want to learn about one of the most important time periods in history, you should read the classical Attic authors. Read them in the original, read them in translation, do both, like I showed you in the recent translation cheating video, ? The classical Attic period is one of the most fascinating I've ever read about. I need to do more videos on it. I honestly don't know where to begin, but I just wanted to make this video to give an outline. Hey, here are the 17, time count right, 4 playwrights, 3 of whom are the tragedians, right, plus Aristophanes, Plato, Thucydides, Xenophon, and then the canon of 10 Attic orators. That's our window into the past. That's the beginning of classical Western literature as we think of it today. Thanks again to Ancient Language Institute, to my Patreon supporters, and to each and every one of you for watching and liking the video. Eroste.